The last thing my father ever said to me was that he was proud of me. 3 days later, he was gone, and my brother was standing in our childhood kitchen, telling me to get out of his house. I keep coming back to those two things. The pride in my father's voice when he squeezed my hand in that hospital room, and then the flatness in my brother's eyes, not anger, not grief, just this cold, business-like flatness as he told me I had 48 hours to collect my things. My name is Tessa. I'm 31 years old. I work as a physical therapist at a clinic in Columbus, Ohio, and for most of my life, I believed I came from a family that, while imperfect, was built on something real. My father worked 30 years as a contractor. My mother passed when I was 12. My brother Connor is 7 years older than me and spent most of my childhood feeling more like a distant relative than a sibling. Someone who showed up at holidays, ate dinner, left early. When Dad got sick, I was the one who moved back. I gave up my apartment in Cincinnati, reduced my hours at the clinic, and drove back to the house on Birchwood Lane where I'd grown up. That was 3 years ago. Connor visited twice during that time, twice in 3 years, once for Thanksgiving, once in March, when Dad had a bad week and the doctors thought it might be close. When the bad week passed, Connor drove back to his life in Portland and didn't call again for 2 months. I don't say this to make myself sound like a martyr. I say it because it matters later. It matters a lot. Dad passed on a Tuesday morning in October. It was quiet, the way the nurses said it often is near the end. I was holding his hand. The hospice worker had stepped out to give us privacy, and it was just me and him and the sound of the neighbor's wind chimes through the window he always liked cracked open, even in the cold. I sat there for a long time before I called anyone. Connor arrived 2 days later with his wife Priscilla and their 2 kids. I'd cleaned the house, arranged the flowers people had started sending, answered maybe 60 phone calls from Dad's friends and former colleagues, and started making funeral arrangements. Connor walked in, looked around, nodded like he was appraising a property, and said, "Good, you handled it." Not "thank you," not "how are you holding up," just "good, you handled it." I told myself grief makes people strange. I gave him room. The funeral was on Friday. It was a gray October day, the kind where the light never quite arrives, just sits low and heavy all afternoon. We buried Dad next to Mom out at Riverside Memorial, and most of his old crew came, guys in their 60s with calloused hands and worn jackets, and they all told me versions of the same thing, that he talked about me constantly, that he was proud of what I'd built, that I had his stubbornness in the best way. Connor gave the eulogy. He did fine. He told a story about Dad teaching him to drive a truck. He cried in a way that looked genuine and I think probably was. Whatever else Connor is, I don't believe he didn't love our father. I just think he loved him from a distance and had made peace with that long ago in a way Dad never fully had. At the reception afterward, I overheard Connor on the phone in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen. I was carrying a stack of paper plates to the kitchen, and the house was loud with people, and I'd just caught a few words through the cracked door. "Already talked to Ashby," he was saying. "Yeah. No, she doesn't know anything yet. Just give me until Monday." Ashby was the name of a law firm downtown. I'd seen their sign my whole life driving past on 4th Street. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Estate stuff. That was normal, right? Connor was the older sibling. Maybe Dad had already been in touch with him about the paperwork. I put the paper plates down and went back to talk to Dad's friends, and I didn't think about it again until Monday. Monday morning, I came downstairs to find Connor at the kitchen table with a man I didn't recognize. Early 50s, gray suit, leather portfolio on the table in front of him. Connor introduced him as Mr. Fielding from Ashby & Cole, the firm on 4th Street. "Tessa," Connor said, and something in his voice had changed. Flatter, more deliberate. "We need to talk about the house." Mr. Fielding slid a document across the table. I didn't pick it up right away. Connor told me that Dad had updated his will 18 months ago, that the house and the majority of the estate, roughly $340,000 after debts, had been designated to him as the eldest child, that my share was $15,000, listed as a gift in recognition of caregiving services. I looked at the paper. I looked at Connor. I said, caregiving services. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, just slightly. Dad wanted to make sure the property stayed in the family line, he said. He was worried about instability, you moving around, Cincinnati, then back here. He didn't know if you'd stay. I moved back here to take care of him for 3 years, and you'll be compensated for that time. $15,000 for 3 years of my life, for the apartment I gave up, the career progression I paused, the friends I drifted from because I was here, in this house, making sure my father ate and took his medication and wasn't alone when the nights got bad. $15,000. I picked up the document. I read it slowly. I set it back down. I need some time, I said. Of course, Mr. Fielding said. He was professionally sympathetic in a way that made my teeth ache. Connor, less so. We're looking at listing the house in the spring. So ideally, you'd be able to finalize your timeline for moving out by end of November. That gives you 6 weeks. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in my childhood bedroom, and I looked at the wall where I'd hung the poster of the Eiffel Tower when I was 14. The same wall I'd stared at all through middle school, and I thought about how my father had looked at me in that hospital room and said he was proud of me. Something didn't add up. I didn't say anything to Connor. I just went to my room and I called an old college friend named Whitney who'd gone to law school. She wasn't an estate attorney, but she knew enough to ask the right questions, and the first question she asked was, when exactly had the will been updated? 18 months ago, I told her. She asked about Dad's condition. 18 months ago. Was he lucid? Had he been diagnosed with anything affecting cognition? I pulled out my phone and went through my photos from that time. 18 months ago, Dad had been in the middle of what his doctors called a period of significant cognitive fluctuation. There was a stretch of about 4 months where he'd been put on a new medication that interacted badly with something else he was taking, and he'd had episodes, confusion, memory gaps, one afternoon where he hadn't recognized me for almost an hour. We'd adjusted the medication, and he'd come back mostly, but those 4 months had been frightening. Whitney said I should get a copy of his full medical records from that period. She also said I should talk to a proper estate attorney before I signed anything, agreed to anything, or moved out of anywhere. I found one through a referral from Dad's old doctor, a woman named Andrea Kowalczyk, who worked out of a small office near the university. She had reading glasses on a beaded chain and a way of listening that made you feel like every word was being weighed and filed. I liked her immediately. I brought her everything I had, the will documents Connor's lawyer had shown me, Dad's medical records, my own records, lease agreements, pay stubs from the clinic showing my reduced hours, receipts from the pharmacy, the grocery store, the medical supply company where I'd bought the hospital-grade bed rail and the shower chair, and the other equipment that had quietly turned our house into something between a home and a care facility over 3 years. Andrea looked to everything for a long time. Then she looked up and said, Tessa, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the 18 months before your father's death, did he ever say anything to you specifically about his estate plans? Anything that felt significant? I thought about it, and then I remembered something. It was about 14 months ago. Dad was having a good day. Those were the days I loved most, when he was sharp and funny and a little ornery, when he'd argue with the TV news and remind me I was loading the dishwasher wrong. We'd eaten dinner, and I was washing up, and he'd come to stand in the kitchen doorway, the way he always did, leaning on the frame with his arms crossed. He'd said, I want you to know I took care of things. I'd asked what things. He'd said, for you. I talked to someone. I want you to be okay when I'm gone. I'd told him to stop talking like that. He'd smiled. We'd watched Jeopardy, and I hadn't thought about it again. When I told Andrea this, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she asked if Dad had an attorney of his own, separate from anyone Connor might have introduced him to. I didn't know, but I knew where to look. Dad kept everything in a fireproof box in the closet of his bedroom. I'd been in there dozens of times for insurance cards and the deed to the truck and other documents. I'd never looked through it systematically, but I'd seen the papers. I went home that afternoon. Connor was out. He and Priscilla had taken the kids to the zoo, some attempt at keeping things normal for them during the trip. I went into Dad's closet and I opened the box and I sat on the floor and I went through every single piece of paper. At the bottom, under the truck title and a folder of old tax returns, there was an envelope, sealed, my name written on the front in Dad's handwriting. That blocky, slightly left-leaning print I'd known my whole life. My hands were not steady when I opened it. Inside was a letter and a business card and another sealed envelope addressed to a man named Robert Kane, attorney at law, at an address I didn't recognize on the east side of the city. The letter was short, Dad's handwriting, unmistakably his, dated 16 months ago. Tessa, it said, if you're reading this, then something went wrong somewhere. Call Robert. He has what you need. I love you more than I knew how to say. I'm sorry I wasn't better at saying it. Dad, I sat on that closet floor for a long time. I called Robert Kane's office from the floor of the closet. His assistant answered. I told her who I was and that I'd found the envelope with the letter. There was a pause, and she said, he's been expecting your call. Can you come in tomorrow morning? Robert Kane was 60-something, quiet, with a handshake like a door firmly closing. His office smelled like old paper and coffee. He told me that my father had come to see him 16 months ago, alone, without telling Connor, without telling anyone, and had asked him to help draft a new document. Not a new will, a trust. A revocable living trust, established in my name, funded with the proceeds of a life insurance policy my father had taken out 12 years ago when my mother died, because he promised himself he would never leave me without something solid. The trust was worth $280,000. It was entirely separate from the estate and the house and anything Connor's will document could touch. Dad had also, Robert told me, written a statement, witnessed and notarized, describing his concerns about Connor's influence over him and his intention that I receive this trust regardless of what any will might later say. He'd written this statement at a time when he was fully lucid, when his doctor had cleared him as competent to make legal decisions, and he had dated and signed it in Robert's presence. Your father was a careful man, Robert said. He was also, I think, a worried one. He loved your brother, but he didn't entirely trust him, and he wanted to make sure you were taken care of. I didn't cry in Robert's office. I cried in my car afterward in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, with my forehead on the steering wheel. Then I called Andrea and told her what I'd found. What followed was not quick, and it was not clean. Andrea filed to contest the will on the grounds that it had been executed during a period of potential cognitive impairment and requested a full review of the circumstances under which it was signed. Connor hired a more expensive version of Mr. Fielding. There were letters back and forth, a deposition, 3 months of tension that made every interaction between me and my brother feel like stepping on ice. Priscilla stopped speaking to me. Connor sent an email saying he hoped I knew what I was doing to this family. I didn't respond. What came out during the discovery process was something I hadn't expected. Connor had been in contact with Dad's original estate attorney, a different firm, one Dad had used for years, and had arranged the meeting where the new will was drafted. He'd told the attorney that Dad wanted to simplify his estate plan. He'd been present at the meeting. He'd driven Dad there. When Andrea deposed the original attorney, she asked whether the attorney had conducted a standard competency check before proceeding. The attorney hedged. She asked whether he'd reviewed the client's medical history. More hedging. She asked whether it was normal practice to allow an interested party, a beneficiary, to be present during the drafting of a will. It was not. The attorney looked uncomfortable for a long time. Then he admitted that Connor had represented himself as Dad's primary caregiver, that he'd been involved in facilitating the meeting, and that he'd stepped out during the actual signing, but had been present for the preliminary conversation. There was also the matter of the numbers. During the 3 years I'd been living at home, Dad's checking account had received regular transfers from his investment account, which was standard, He'd set up an automatic withdrawal to cover living expenses, but when Andrea's forensic accountant looked at the statements, she found that starting about 2 years ago, there had been additional withdrawals, irregular amounts, sent to a third account that was not a household expense account. That account, it turned out, was a joint account Connor had opened with Dad in 2021, framed at the time, according to the documents, as a convenience account in case Dad needed Connor to manage expenses remotely. Connor had used it to transfer a total of $94,000 over 26 months. I didn't know about this account. I never heard of it. When my attorney presented this to Connor's attorney, there was a long silence in the conference room. Then there was a recess. Then there were settlement discussions. Connor called me himself that evening. I hadn't heard him cry since our mother's funeral. He cried on the phone. He said he hadn't thought of it as stealing, that he'd told himself Dad would want him to have it, that he'd been dealing with his own financial problems, and Dad had seemed willing, that he'd meant to pay it back. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said, Connor, I am not the one you need to convince. The estate settled 4 months later. The trust was mine outright. Robert had been right that it was entirely insulated from the will dispute. The will itself was found invalid on the grounds of undue influence and questions of competency, and the estate reverted to intestate succession, which under Ohio law meant Connor and I split it equally. That came to about $85,000 each after legal fees. The $94,000 was addressed separately. Connor avoided criminal charges by agreeing to repay the full amount with interest, which came out of his share and then some. I didn't push for prosecution. I'm not sure I made the right call there. I think about it sometimes, but I was tired in a way that went down to my bones, and I didn't want to spend another year in lawyers' offices. What I did was my portion of the estate, after everything was settled, was buy back the clinic hours I'd given up, pay off my student loans, and establish a small fund through the hospice organization that had cared for my father in his last weeks. It provides grocery gift cards to family caregivers, the people like me who give up apartments and career trajectory, and the ordinary momentum of their own lives to be with someone at the end. It's not a grand gesture. It's $100 here, $100 there. But I know what it means when you've been driving back and forth to doctor's appointments for 2 years and you realize you haven't been to a grocery store that isn't on the way home from somewhere else. I still drive past the house on Birchwood Lane sometimes. Connor sold it in the spring to a young couple with a dog. They painted the front door red. Dad would have had thoughts about that. What I keep coming back to, in the quiet moments, is that letter. That sealed envelope at the bottom of the fireproof box, with my name on it, in my father's handwriting. He'd planned for the possibility that something would go wrong. He'd known that loving someone doesn't always protect them, and he'd done what he could anyway. He'd also written that he was sorry he wasn't better at saying it. I've thought about that a lot. The things we mean and don't say. The distances we let grow between ourselves and the people we love. Not from cruelty, just from the assumption that there's more time. Connor and I don't have a relationship right now. Maybe we will someday. I don't know. I don't hate him. It would probably be easier if I did. What I know is that my father saw me, that in a hospital room on the last good day he had, he told me he was proud of me, and he meant it, and he had already made sure I would be okay, long before he needed to. I think about those wind chimes. I think about his handwriting on that envelope, blocky and slightly left-leaning, the same as it had been my whole life. That's what I carry. I still think about that fireproof box. My father kept it in the back of his closet, behind an old pair of work boots he never threw away. He kept his truck title in there, his tax returns, his insurance cards, ordinary things, and at the very bottom, under all of it, he kept a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in that blocky handwriting I'd known since I was a little girl. Because he understood something I hadn't yet, that love without forethought isn't enough, that caring about someone means doing the hard, quiet work of protecting them, even when you won't be there to see it through. That's what I think about when people ask me if I'm angry at Connor, and honestly, I was for a while. I won't pretend I wasn't. There were nights during those months of depositions and legal letters when the anger sat in my chest like something physical. But anger, I've learned, is only useful for so long. At some point, you have to decide what you're going to build with what happened to you, or it just becomes a story you carry around without going anywhere. What carried me through wasn't rage, it was clarity. The moment I found that letter, something in me went very still and very focused. I stopped reacting and started thinking. I called Whitney. I found Andrea. I went through every document, every bank statement, every date. I asked the questions that felt uncomfortable to ask, that kind of clear-headed, deliberate thinking, the willingness to look directly at something painful and say, what is actually true here? That's what made the difference. Not luck, not connections, just refusing to accept a story that didn't hold up and doing the methodical work of finding out why. And there was something else that mattered. I stayed. That's the part people sometimes gloss over when they hear this story. They jump to the lawyer, the trust, the courtroom. But before any of that, I just stayed. 3 years in that house, reducing my hours, missing things, giving up the ordinary momentum of my own life because my father needed someone present. That choice didn't feel heroic at the time. It felt like the only thing to do, but I think that consistency, showing up when it wasn't convenient, not because anyone was watching, but because it was right, that's what my father saw. That's what he was honoring when he sat down with Robert and made sure I would be okay. Connor had more advantages than I did in almost every way. He's older. He had more money, more confidence, more time to work on Dad when I wasn't in the room. What he didn't have was integrity. And what I've come to understand is that integrity isn't a soft thing. It isn't just about feeling good about yourself. It's load-bearing. It's the thing that holds up when everything else gets tested, when the will gets contested, when the forensic accountant starts pulling statements, when the attorney asks a question under oath that you can't answer cleanly. Connor's story collapsed, not because I was smarter or luckier, but because it was built on something that couldn't hold weight. Mine held. Dad knew the difference. He'd watched both of us our whole lives, and he knew. That envelope at the bottom of the fireproof box, that was him telling me so.